Arlo Finch was not the kind of boy anyone noticed. He was not the tallest cadet at Station Verith 9. He was not the strongest. He did not win fights in the training hall or shout the loudest in the mess room. When other cadets walked into a room, people turned their heads. When Arlo walked in, people kept eating. He had been at the academy for 7 months now. 7 months of waking up before the lights came on, pulling on his gray uniform, and walking to morning drills with his head down and his hands in his pockets. 7 months of sitting at the end of the bench at meals because the seats in the middle were always taken by the time he arrived. 7 months of listening to Bram Solis, the loudest Vorkai cadet in the whole station, make jokes about the quiet human boy who never said anything back. The Vorkai were tall, scaled, and proud. They had been part of the Interstellar Academy for over 200 years. They trained hard, competed loudly, and believed that strength was the only language worth speaking. To them, Arlo was a curiosity at best and a joke at worst. Bram had given him a name in the first week. Not a mean name, exactly. Just a small, dismissive one. He called him the pet boy. It spread fast. Even cadets from other species used it, not always to be cruel, some just thought it was funny. Arlo never corrected anyone. He just nodded and kept walking. The name came from what Arlo did in his free hours. Most cadets used their free time to train, to sleep, or to sit in the common room and argue about which species had the best combat record. Arlo used his free time to walk to the lower levels of the station, past the maintenance corridors and the old storage rooms, to a section most cadets had never visited, the beast pens. The beast pens were not a popular place. They smelled like something wild and old. The creatures kept there were Dracari, large, four-legged animals used by the Academy for scouting missions in hostile terrain. They looked something like a cross between a big cat and a creature with too many teeth. Their eyes were golden and very still. Their handlers wore thick protective suits and carried stun rods at all times. 3 handlers had been injured in the past year alone. Nobody went near the beast pens for fun. Nobody except Arlo. He never explained why, not to anyone. If someone had asked him, he probably could not have found the right words anyway. It was not a decision he made. It was just something he did, the same way other people breathed, without thinking about it, without needing a reason. He felt calmer near the animals. The noise of the station, the drills, the shouting, the constant competition, faded away down there. In the pens, everything was quiet and honest. The Dracari never pretended. They either wanted you near them or they didn't. There was no politics in that. Arlo appreciated it more than he could say. He had learned quickly which animals were comfortable with his presence and which ones weren't. He never pushed. He never reached through the gates without waiting first. He would just sit on the floor outside the pen, back against the wall, and let the animal decide. Most of them came to the gate eventually. Not all of them. But most. There was one, though, that nobody went near. The handlers called it Subject 9. It had arrived at the station 4 months ago, brought in by a military scout ship that had found it injured in a debris field at the edge of a dying solar system. It was younger than the other Dracari, smaller, but that didn't make it less dangerous. In fact, the handler said it was the most dangerous animal in the pens. It had broken one handler's arm through the gate on the first day. It had not let anyone come within 3 meters of it since. It did not eat when the handlers were watching. It sat in the far corner of its pen and stared at the wall. The station veterinarian had said quietly that if the animal didn't start eating properly within another few weeks, it probably wouldn't survive. Arlo had started sitting outside Subject 9's pen 2 months ago. He did not try to get close. He did not speak to it. He just sat outside the gate the same way he sat outside all the other pens, back against the wall, legs crossed, doing nothing. The first few times the animal didn't even turn around. Then, after about a week, it started turning its head to look at him when he arrived. Not in an aggressive way. Just looking. The way you look at something unfamiliar that hasn't given you a reason to run yet. Arlo started calling it Ash. Not out loud, just in his head. It felt right. A month passed. Then another. And slowly, so slowly that even Arlo almost didn't notice it happening, Ash began to change. It started eating more. It stopped pressing itself into the corner. One evening, it walked up to the gate and sat down on the other side, less than a meter from where Arlo was sitting. Arlo didn't move. Ash didn't move. They just sat like that until the lights dimmed for the night cycle. That was the closest Arlo had ever been to it. Until the morning everything changed. It started the way most bad mornings started, with Bram Solis. Arlo had been heading to the lower levels before drills, earlier than usual, because he had woken up at the wrong time and couldn't get back to sleep. He passed Bram and 2 other Vorkai cadets in the corridor near the maintenance level. Bram looked at him, looked at the direction he was heading, and grinned his wide, scaled grin. Pet Boy is going to visit his friends, Bram said to the others. They laughed. Arlo kept walking. He reached the pens while the corridor was still empty. The handlers didn't come on shift for another 20 minutes. He sat down outside Ash's pen the way he always did. Ash was already awake, already watching the gate. Its golden eyes tracked Arlo as he settled against the wall. Then Arlo noticed the animal's side. The wound from when Ash had been found, the one the veterinarian said was healing, didn't look healed. It looked worse. There was a dark, wet mark along the lower ribs that hadn't been there the last time he looked. Ash was holding itself slightly stiff, the way an animal does when moving hurts. Arlo stood up slowly. He looked at the gate latch. He looked at Ash. He knew what the rules were. He had been told twice, politely but clearly, that no cadet was ever to open a pen gate without a handler present. He understood why. He opened the gate anyway. He didn't run inside. He didn't walk fast. He moved the way you move when you're trying not to startle something. Slow, low, deliberate. He kept his eyes soft, not staring hard the way predators stare. He let his hands hang loose at his sides. Ash watched him come. The animal's muscles tensed. Its ears pressed back. For one long second, Arlo thought he had made a terrible mistake. He stopped. He waited. He breathed out slowly. Ash's ears came back up. Arlo took one more step forward and then sat down on the floor of the pen, cross-legged, the same way he always sat outside it. He didn't reach for the animal. He just sat there inside the pen now, close enough to see the wound clearly. It was a deep cut, longer than his hand, and it needed attention. He was looking at it carefully when he heard voices behind him. 2 handlers had come in early. Behind them, moving fast, was Commander Vesk, a tall, sharp-eyed being who ran the academy with very few words and very firm expectations. And behind Vesk, because of course it had to be, was Bram Solace, who had apparently followed Arlo out of boredom and was now watching through the open pen door with his mouth slightly open. Nobody spoke for a moment. Arlo looked up at them from where he was sitting on the floor. Ash was beside him, close enough that its shoulder touched Arlo's arm. The animal was not growling. It was not tense. It was just sitting there, calm and still, pressed lightly against the boy who had walked into its pen without armor, without a stun rod, and without any good reason. Commander Vesk looked at the animal. Then he looked at Arlo. His expression did not change. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said in a very flat, very careful voice, "Step out of the pen, cadet." Arlo stood up slowly. Ash watched him go but did not follow. At the gate, Arlo paused and looked back once. Ash's golden eyes were steady. Bram said nothing. For the first time in 7 months he had absolutely nothing to say. Arlo did not get punished. That surprised him more than anything else that had happened that morning. Commander Vesk had walked him to a small side room near the administrative corridor, sat across from him at a plain metal table, and asked him 3 questions. What was he doing in the pen? How long had he been visiting the animals? And had anyone told him to stop? Arlo answered honestly. He was checking the wound. 7 months. No. Vesk listened without expression. Then he stood up, told Arlo he was not to enter any pen without a handler present from this point forward, and dismissed him. No extra drills. No formal report. Nothing. Arlo walked out of that room not quite sure what had just happened. Bram had clearly expected something louder. When Arlo showed up at morning drills 10 minutes late with no explanation and no sign of punishment, Bram stared at him for a long moment before turning away. He didn't say anything about the pet boy that day. Or the next. It didn't last, of course. It never did. But for a few days the corridor was quieter than usual, and Arlo was grateful for it. He kept his mother's notes in a small folded envelope inside the front pocket of his kit bag. The envelope was soft at the edges from being opened and closed so many times. The paper inside was thin and slightly yellow and covered in his mother's handwriting, small, careful letters that leaned a little to the right, like they were always in a hurry. Nora Finch had died 3 years ago when Arlo was 14. She had lived her whole life on a small farming colony on the outer edge of settled human space, a quiet place with red soil and long summers and more animals than people. She had been a gentle woman who spoke slowly and noticed everything. She had started writing the notes when Arlo was about 6 years old. After the 3rd time she found him sitting calmly in the middle of a field with a wild animal that should have run from him. She never made a big deal of it. She just wrote things down the way you write down something you want to remember clearly. The notes were not long. Some were just a sentence or 2. But Arlo had read them so many times he could recite most of them from memory. One of them said, "Animals don't listen to what you say. They listen to what you are. You can't lie to them. They already know." Another said, You have never once tried to be something you weren't. That's rarer than you think, Arlo. Most people forget how to do that before they're 10 years old. He had never fully understood what she meant by that when he was young. He was starting to understand it now. Petra Hale had been at Station Verith 9 for 5 months, which was 2 months less than Arlo. She had arrived quiet and stayed that way, which was probably why Arlo had noticed her before she noticed him. She sat at the far end of the bench at meals. She answered questions in training with short, accurate answers and no extras. She didn't seem to be trying to impress anyone, which, at an academy full of species that competed for everything, made her stand out in a backwards kind of way. She had started talking to Arlo about 6 weeks after she arrived, in the most ordinary way possible. She had sat down next to him at breakfast because every other seat was taken and asked him to pass the water. They had eaten in comfortable silence. She had come back the next morning and done the same thing. That was, as far as Arlo was concerned, the beginning of a friendship. Petra was sharp and she was honest, and she did not pretend to find things funny when she didn't. She also asked questions the way some people threw rocks, directly, without much warning, and usually hitting something. It was 3 days after the pen incident when she asked him about his mother. They were sitting in the small common room at the end of the human cadets' residential corridor, which was almost always empty in the late evening because most people were either training or sleeping. Arlo had the envelope out. He had been reading through the notes again the way he sometimes did when the station felt too loud even when it was quiet. Petra looked at the paper in his hands and said, "What is that?" Arlo told her. Not everything, just the basic shape of it: his mother, the farm, the notes. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But Petra listened the way she always listened, with her full attention and without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I read one?" He hesitated. Then he handed her the one about lying. She read it twice. She handed it back carefully, like she understood it was not just paper. "Is that why the animals trust you?" she asked. "Because you don't pretend?" "I don't know," Arlo said. "My mum thought so." "Do you think so?" He looked at the note in his hands. "I think I never really thought about it. It's just how I am." Petra nodded slowly. "That's probably exactly why it works," she said. Then she looked at him with the direct expression she always used when she was about to ask something she actually wanted to know the answer to. "Show me," she said. Arlo took her to the pens the next evening, during the quiet window after the handler's last check and before the night cycle lights dimmed. He had told the on-duty handler where he was going, the way he always did now. The handler, a broad, tired-looking man named Goff who had worked the pens for 11 years, just waved him through without looking up from his log. Petra stayed close behind Arlo as they walked down the long corridor between the pens. She said nothing, but he could tell from the way she moved that she was taking everything in: the smell, the sounds, the size of the animals visible through the gate bars. One of the larger Dracari turned its head to watch them pass. Petra's pace slowed slightly. She didn't stop, but she slowed. Arlo brought her to Ash's pen last. Ash was already awake, standing near the center of the pen. The wound on its side had been treated by the station veterinarian 2 days after the incident, and it was healing properly now. The animal looked stronger than it had a week ago. Its golden eyes found Arlo the moment they appeared at the gate. Petra stood beside Arlo and looked at the animal. "That's the one you went inside with?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Arlo said. "It's bigger than I thought it would be. Most things are." He crouched down in front of the gate. Not performing anything, not doing anything in particular. Just crouching down the way he always did and being still. Petra stayed standing beside him. Ash walked to the gate. Not slowly, not cautiously, just walked the way you walk toward something familiar. It came all the way to the bars and sat down on the other side, less than an arm's length from Arlo's face. Its breath came in slow, warm pulls. Its eyes were calm. Petra took one step back. Just one. A small, involuntary step that she probably didn't notice herself taking. Arlo didn't move at all. Ash's nose came forward through the bars slightly. Arlo raised his hand, not fast, not reaching, just raising it slowly until his fingers were near the gate. Ash sniffed his hand once. Then it pressed its broad forehead lightly against the bars, exactly the way it had done a handful of times before, and closed its eyes. Nobody spoke. After a long moment, Petra said very quietly, "How are you doing that?" "I'm not doing anything," Arlo said. "You're doing something. I'm just not pretending." He glanced up at her. "That's what my mum said. That's all it is." Petra looked at Ash's closed eyes, at its enormous head resting against the gate bars, at the complete and total calm of an animal that had broken a grown man's arm through those same bars. She didn't step back again. But she didn't step forward either. She just stood very still and watched, and Arlo could tell from her face that she was trying to understand something that didn't quite fit into any of the categories she already had. He knew that feeling. He had lived with it his whole life. Ash opened its eyes after a while and looked at Arlo again. Arlo looked back. The station hummed quietly around them. Somewhere above them, 100 species were competing and training and arguing and trying to prove things to each other. Down here nothing needed proving. Petra crossed her arms slowly over her chest, looked at the animal one more time, and then said the only thing she could think of that seemed close enough to the truth. "Your mum sounds like she was very smart," she said. Arlo nodded. "She was the smartest person I ever knew," he said. And she never once raised her voice to say it. The announcement went up on the board 3 days before the grand trial. Every cadet stopped in front of it at some point during that morning. Some read it once and walked away. Some read it twice. A few stood there longer than necessary, running their eyes down the team lists with the focused expression of people doing quiet calculations. Who was strong, who was weak, which team had a real chance and which one didn't. Bram Solis read it and then he laughed. Not a small laugh. A real one, loud enough that the cadets near him turned to look. He pointed at the board with one scaled finger and said something in Vorkai to the 2 cadets beside him. They laughed too. Then Bram looked across the corridor to where Arlo was standing a few meters away, reading the same board, and said in common tongue so everyone could hear. They gave the pet boy a team. Arlo read his name at the top of Team 7. Below it were 4 other names. Petra Hale. Finn Darrow, a human cadet who was quiet and careful and not very confident in open situations. And 2 Vorkai cadets, Dale and Sorn, who were not Bram's closest companions but moved in the same circles and shared the same general opinion of humans. Team leader. Arlo Finch. Team 7. He stared at it for a moment. Then he picked up his kit bag and walked to morning drills without saying anything. The grand trial happened once a year. It was the Academy's biggest test, not of individual skill but of how a team moved together under pressure. The simulation took place in the lower training bay, a large sealed environment that could be reconfigured into different terrain types. This year it was set as a rocky open landscape with low cover, uneven ground and poor sightlines. The mission was straightforward on paper. Each team had to cross the terrain, locate a down signal beacon, retrieve it, and reach the extraction point on the far side. No lethal weapons. Stun rods only. Time limit of 40 minutes. What the announcement on the board had not mentioned, what the instructors told each team only at the briefing the morning of the trial, was that 3 live Dracari had been released into the terrain. Not simulated. Not mechanical. Live animals moved from the pens that morning. The briefing room went very quiet when the lead instructor, a flat-voiced being named Proctor Dell, said this out loud. Then it went loud again, fast, with the particular energy of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about the next 40 minutes. Arlo sat in the second row and said nothing. Petra beside him looked at him once. He didn't look back but he felt it. Proctor Dell explained the rules. The Dracari were not to be engaged unless a cadet was in direct physical danger. Teams were expected to navigate around the animals if possible. Stun rods were available as a last resort. Any cadet who was knocked down by a Dracari and tagged by the animal sensor collar was considered eliminated from the trial. 3 animals. 5 cadets per team. 40 minutes. Bram's team was briefed in the same session. On the way out, Bram passed Arlo's chair and stopped just long enough to say, quietly and with great satisfaction, "Good luck, pet boy. You're going to need all of it." Team 7 gathered at their starting gate 20 minutes later. Dale and Sorn arrived already irritated. They stood apart from Arlo and Petra and Finn, not bothering to pretend they were interested in working as a unit. Dale was cleaning his stun rod with a cloth. Sorn was looking at the terrain through the gate window with his arms crossed. Finn stood close to Petra. He was pale and turning his stun rod over in his hands repeatedly without realizing he was doing it. Arlo looked at all 4 of them and then looked at the terrain beyond the gate. The rocky landscape was gray and still under the simulation lights. He couldn't see any of the animals yet. That didn't mean much. He turned to face his team. "When we go in," he said, "stay behind me and stay quiet. If we see a Dracari, nobody moves until I say." Dale looked at him sideways. "You want us to stand still when a Dracari charges? I want you to let me handle it first." Sorn made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're going to handle a Dracari?" "Yes," Arlo said simply. Neither of them responded to that. It was said so flatly, with so little need for agreement, that it left no obvious place for argument. Finn stopped turning his stun rod over. Petra looked at Arlo with a steady expression that said she believed him and was also, underneath that, quietly terrified. The gate opened. They moved in a loose line, Arlo at the front, Petra just behind his left shoulder, Finn behind her, Dale and Sorn at the rear making no effort to close the gap. The terrain was uneven and the rocks threw strange shadows under the overhead lights. The signal beacon was somewhere in the middle third of the map, according to the briefing. The extraction point was at the far end. They had been walking for about 6 minutes when Arlo stopped. He raised one hand without turning around. The team stopped behind him. Ahead, between two large rock formations, a Dracary was standing in the path. It was facing them. Its ears were forward and its eyes were bright and fixed. It was not charging. It was deciding. Behind Arlo, he heard Dale quietly activate his stun rod. The low hum of it filled the silence. "Turn that off," Arlo said. "It's right there," Dale said. "I know. Turn it off." Pause. The hum stopped. Arlo crouched down slowly. All the way down, one knee on the rock, making himself smaller. He let his hands rest loose in front of him. He dropped his eyes slightly, not looking away from the animal completely, but softening the stare, taking the challenge out of it. He breathed in. He breathed out. Slowly. Steadily. Like there was no hurry in the world. The Dracary's ears shifted. One forward, one back. Arlo breathed out again. The animal's head lowered slightly. His weight shifted back. It was a small change, barely visible, but Arlo felt it the way you feel a room change when the tension goes out of it. He waited another 10 seconds. Then he stood up slowly, took 3 steps to the left, and began walking a wide, calm arc around the animal's position. He looked back once and nodded. Petra moved first, keeping her steps quiet. Finn followed her, eyes forward, not looking at the Dracary directly. Dale and Sorn came last, moving faster than the others, their whole posture radiating the discomfort of people doing something that went against every instinct they had. The Dracary watched them pass. It did not follow. The second animal found them near the beacon. It came around a rock fast, closer than the first one, and stopped less than 4 meters from Finn, who made a sharp sound and stumbled back a step. The Dracary locked onto the movement. Its body went rigid. Arlo stepped in front of Finn in one smooth motion and crouched again. Same stillness. Same breath. Slower this time because this animal was more agitated and he could see it in the tension along its shoulders. He waited longer. Almost a full minute passed. Behind him nobody spoke, nobody moved, and Arlo was quietly grateful because any sound right now would have made this much harder. The animal's shoulders dropped. It looked at Arlo for another long moment, then turned and walked away into the rocks. Finn let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for the entire minute. The third Dracary they heard before they saw it, a low sound from somewhere above them on a rock ledge. Arlo looked up, found it, and simply stood still and waited until the animal lost interest and moved along the ridge away from them. He never crouched that time. He just stood. That was enough. They retrieved the beacon. They reached the extraction point with 4 minutes to spare. The walk back through the gate was quiet. Proctor Dell and 2 other instructors were waiting at the monitoring station. One of them had a stylus in her hand that she had apparently stopped using at some point during the trial and had not started again. Dell looked at the team as they came through and said nothing for a moment. Then he made a note on his board and moved on to the next team's debrief. Dale and Sorn walked ahead without speaking. Finn was still breathing carefully like a person making sure they still knew how. Petra walked beside Arlo and didn't say anything either, but she reached over once and knocked her knuckle lightly against his arm. A small, quick gesture that said more than most sentences could. Bram Solis was standing near the far wall with his team. His stun rod had been discharged twice. His team had lost 2 members to Dracary tags. They had retrieved the beacon but used 38 of their 40 minutes doing it. He watched Arlo walk past. He didn't say pet boy. He didn't say anything at all. He just watched, with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite anything else either. Something in between, something that hadn't had a name for him before today. Arlo didn't look at him. He didn't need to. It started with a sound. Not an explosion. Not an alarm. Just a deep, low vibration that moved through the floor of the station like something very large had exhaled against the outer hull. It was the kind of sound that didn't hurt your ears but settled in your chest and stayed there. Arlo felt it in his bunk at 0340 station time. He sat up. The sound came again, slower this time, longer. The metal walls of the residential corridor hummed faintly with it. He looked at the bunk across from him. Finn was already awake, sitting up with wide eyes and both hands flat on his mattress like he was checking if the ground was real. Then the alarms came on. Not the drill alarm, which was 2 short tones and a pause. This was the full emergency alert, a continuous sound, loud and even, the kind that meant something was actually wrong. The corridor lights switched from dim night cycle yellow to flat white. Doors opened up and down the hall. Cadets came out in various states of dress, blinking and looking at each other for information nobody had yet. A voice came over the station system. It was calm, which somehow made it worse. All cadets report to designated safety stations. This is not a drill. All cadets report to designated safety stations. That was all it said. The corridors filled fast. Arlo moved with the current of bodies for about 30 seconds before he stopped, let the crowd push past him and turn the other direction. Petra appeared at his shoulder from somewhere in the crowd as if she had expected this. "Where are you going?" she asked. "The pens," he said. She didn't ask why. She followed him. They moved against the flow of cadets heading toward the upper safety stations, down 2 maintenance stairwells, through the long gray corridor that smelled like coolant and old metal, and into the lower level. The beast pens were quiet when they arrived. The animals were awake, all of them, standing or pacing with their ears up and their eyes wide. Something had reached them through the walls that hadn't reached the cadets yet. Handler Goff was not at his station. The monitoring desk was empty, its screen still running. Arlo went straight to Ash's pen. What he saw stopped him. Ash was not pacing. Ash was not pressing against the gate or making noise. Ash was standing in the exact center of the pen, completely still, with its head raised and its eyes fixed on the ceiling, or beyond it, through it, at something far above the station that Arlo could not see. Every muscle in the animal's body was taut, not with fear but with something else. Something that looked, in a way Arlo had no words for yet, like recognition. The low vibration came through the floor again. Stronger this time. Ash made a sound. Arlo had heard Ash make sounds before. Small ones, low ones, the quiet animal sounds of a creature settling or shifting or responding to something nearby. This was not that. This sound came from somewhere deep in the animal's chest and moved outward slowly, like a note played on something very large and very old. It was not a cry. It was not a warning. It was an answer. Arlo stood at the gate and felt every hair on his arms rise. He found a working monitor at Goff's desk and pulled up the external sensor feed. The screen took a moment to load. When it did, he stared at it without speaking. Petra leaned over his shoulder, looked at the screen and said nothing either. The station's external cameras showed space. Normal space, stars, the distant smear of a nebula to the left, the faint curve of the nearest planetoid at the edge of frame. All of that was the same as always. What was not the same were the shapes. They were everywhere. Arranged in a wide ring around Station Verith 9, spread across every camera angle on every side. Above, below, left, right, every direction at once. They were dark against the stars, which was the only reason it took the eye a moment to count them. There were at least 40 that Arlo could see clearly. Probably more. Each one was enormous. Not ship enormous. Not the functional, angular size of a military vessel. These were living enormous. The kind of size that didn't look real until you found something to compare it against, and then your mind went quiet for a moment while it adjusted. The station itself was large enough to house 800 beings and all their equipment. These creatures were longer. Several of them were wider. They moved with the slow, deliberate ease of things that had never needed to hurry. Dragon-class Drakkari. Arlo had read about them twice. Once in a species catalog that described them as unconfirmed, possibly mythological, and once in a single military report from 60 years ago that used the words massive biological entities, unresponsive to all contact attempts, withdrew without engagement. He had not thought much about either entry at the time. He was thinking about them now. Not one. Not a scout. A fleet. And they were not moving. They were just there, surrounding the station on every side in total silence, doing nothing at all. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not the size of them. Not the number. The stillness. A creature that large, in that number, with that much obvious capability, and they were simply waiting. Arlo turned around and looked at Ash. Ash was still standing in the center of the pen. Still looking upward. Still making that low, deep sound at long intervals, slow as breathing. And then Arlo understood. It was not a complicated thought. It did not arrive with any great ceremony. It just settled into place the way true things do, quietly, completely, without needing to argue for itself. Ash was not a beast. Ash was not a scout animal. Ash was a child, a young one separated from its family somehow, injured and alone in a debris field at the edge of a dying system, picked up by a military ship that had no idea what it was actually carrying. Brought here. Penned here. Kept here for months while the station went about its business above. And the fleet outside, 40 creatures the size of warships, surrounding the station in perfect silence, was the family. They had come looking. They did not know if Ash was alive. They did not know if the beings inside had helped or harmed. They could not tell friend from captor. And they had been patient, which was perhaps the most frightening thing of all because it meant that patience was a choice, and choices could end. Arlo stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of Goff's chair and said to Petra, "I need to find Vesk." Commander Vesk was in the situation room on the upper operations level, which was where Arlo expected him to be. Getting there took longer than it should have. The corridors were crowded and twice a security officer tried to redirect Arlo to a safety station. He kept walking. The situation room had a thick door that was currently closed. Arlo knocked on it. Nobody answered. He knocked again harder. The door opened. A staff officer looked at him with the expression of someone who had no time for whatever this was. "Cadet," the officer said in a tone that finished the sentence with "go away." "I need to speak to Commander Vesk," Arlo said. "Right now. It's about the fleet outside. Every person on this station is concerned about." "I know what they are," Arlo said. "And I know why they're here." There was a pause. The officer looked at him, really looked for the first time since the door opened. Then he stepped back. The situation room was full. Staff officers at every monitor, voices overlapping, screens showing the same external feeds Arlo had seen downstairs. At the far end, standing with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the largest screen, was Commander Vesk. He was watching the fleet. He turned when Arlo entered, and his expression did not change. It was the same flat, careful expression he had worn in the pen the morning he found Arlo sitting next to Ash. Arlo walked across the room to him. He was aware of everyone watching. He told Vesk in simple, plain words what he believed. The juvenile in the pens. The sound it was making. The way it had been looking upward since the vibration started. The fleet outside that was not attacking, not communicating, not leaving. Just waiting. Vesk listened without interrupting. He looked at Arlo for a long moment when he finished. Then he turned back to the screen. The fleet sat motionless in the dark, enormous and still and patient as old mountains. The station's entire weapons array was armed and aimed and completely, obviously useless against something of this size and number. The diplomats had been broadcasting peace signals for 20 minutes and receiving nothing. 40 creatures the size of warships, waiting for an answer nobody on the station knew how to give. Vesk looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at Arlo. "Can you reach them?" he asked. It was a quiet question. Just 4 words. But in a room full of officers and monitors and armed weapons systems and 40 years of interstellar military experience, it was also the only question that made any sense. Arlo looked at the screen. At the fleet. At the dark, still shapes that had crossed however much of the galaxy it had taken to find one lost child. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know how to try." Nobody in the situation room spoke when Vesk gave the order. He said it simply and without hesitation, the way he said most things, quietly, and with the kind of weight that made people listen without needing to be told twice. He said that Cadet Arlo Finch was to be given access to the beast pens, that the juvenile Drackery designated Subject 9 was to be released from its pen under Arlo's supervision, and that both of them were to be escorted to the outer observation deck on level 2. One of the senior staff officers started to say something. Vesk looked at him. The officer stopped. 2 security officers walked with Arlo back down to the lower level. They didn't speak to him on the way. He didn't speak to them either. There was nothing useful to say. The station was still on full alert, the alarms had been reduced to a low background tone, and the corridors that had been crowded an hour ago were now empty. Every cadet and most of the staff were at their designated stations, watching monitors, waiting for something to happen. Outside the hull, nothing had changed. The fleet was still there. Still. Goff was back at his desk when Arlo arrived at the pens. He looked up when Arlo came in with the 2 security officers, looked at the officers, looked back at Arlo, and then at the authorization code on the small screen one of the officers held out to him. He read it twice. Then he stood up slowly like a man whose knees hurt and said, "You're taking 9 out." "Yes," Arlo said. Goff looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite concern, not quite disbelief, somewhere between the two. He had worked the pens for 11 years. He had seen a lot of animals and a reasonable number of people who thought they understood animals. He had formed a private opinion about Arlo over the past several months that he had never said out loud to anyone. He picked up his access card without another word and walked to Ash's pen. Ash heard them coming. By the time they reached the gate, the animal was already standing at the front of the pen, Eyes on Arlo, body language completely different from the taut, upward-focused stillness of an hour ago. Something had shifted. Ash knew, the way animals know things that haven't been announced yet, that something was about to change. Goff unlocked the gate and stepped back. Arlo opened it and walked in. He didn't put a lead on Ash. There was no lead on the station that would have fit anyway, and more importantly, it would have been the wrong thing. A lead was for an animal, and Ash was not an animal. Arlo understood that now in a way he hadn't fully put into words even for himself, but understood completely in the way you understand things that matter. He simply walked in, stood beside Ash for a moment, and then walked back out through the gate. Ash followed him. The two security officers took a single step back when Ash came through the gate into the open corridor. Neither of them reached for their weapons, which Arlo appreciated. Ash looked at them once with its golden eyes, decided they were not relevant, and turned its attention back to Arlo. They walked to the observation deck together. Arlo and Ash side by side, the two officers following at a distance that gradually increased the longer the walk went on. The outer observation deck on level 2 was a long room with a curved transparent wall that looked directly out into space. It was used mostly for navigation briefings and the occasional ceremony. Right now it was empty except for a single technician who had been sent ahead to confirm the external cameras were active and the weapons array on this side of the station had a clear line of sight. The technician left when Arlo arrived. Quickly. Arlo stood in front of the curved wall and looked out. The fleet was there, exactly as it had been on the monitors, but seeing it on a screen and standing in front of it with nothing but a thin transparent wall between were two different experiences entirely. On screen it had looked large. In person, with the actual dark of space behind it and no frame around the image, it looked like something for which large was not a sufficient word. The nearest dragon was perhaps 200 meters from the hull. It was facing the station. Its eyes, and Arlo could see its eyes from here, which told him something about how big those eyes were open and still. Ash made the low, deep sound again. Right beside Arlo's shoulder, close enough that he felt it in his ribs. From outside, through the hull, through the wall, through however much physics stood between them, something answered. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just present. A vibration that moved through the floor and up through Arlo's feet and settled somewhere behind his sternum. He breathed. Vesk's voice came through the small speaker on the wall behind him. We're watching on the monitors, Cadet. Weapons are standing by. You have the floor. Arlo didn't respond. Not rudely, he just had no words to spare right now. Everything he had needed to go into what came next. He looked out at the fleet. At the nearest dragon. At the one beyond it, and the one beyond that, spread out across the dark in every direction like a constellation that had decided to move closer. He thought about what he knew. He did not speak Dracari. He did not have a translator for something that had never been recorded. He had no diplomatic training, no protocol, no script. What he had was 7 months of sitting on cold floors and learning how to be still. What he had was his mother's handwriting on thin paper telling him that you cannot lie to something that already knows. What he had was the understanding, slow-built and now completely solid, that the creatures outside were not enemies. They were parents, and they were frightened, and they had been waiting in the only way they knew how. He crouched down beside Ash. Not performing it. Not thinking about the cameras or the weapons array or Commander Vesk watching on a monitor somewhere above him. Just crouching down the way he had crouched on cold floors in the pens for 7 months, making himself smaller, taking the height and the authority out of his posture, becoming something that was not a threat and not a captor and not a stranger pretending to be safe. He lowered his head. It was the gesture Ash had shown him 3 weeks ago, pressing its own head down and forward, slowly, the way you bow to something you trust completely. Arlo had looked it up afterward in every Dracari behavioral record the Academy had, which were not many and not detailed. None of them mentioned the gesture. He had decided it didn't matter. Ash had shown it to him, and Ash had not been wrong about anything yet. He held the position. Head down, hands loose, breathing slowly. Ash stood beside him and went completely still. Outside, the nearest dragon moved. Not toward them, not a charge, not a threat. It simply drifted closer, the way something moves when it is trying to see more clearly. It came to perhaps 50 meters. Then 40. Then it stopped. Every alarm sensor on the weapons array lit up. Arlo heard, faintly, the mechanical sound of targeting systems adjusting. He raised one hand behind him, flat, palm out. Wait. The room stayed quiet. The dragon outside was close enough now that its breath, or whatever the equivalent was slightly visible, a faint distortion in the space around its mouth. It was looking at Ash. Then at Arlo. Then at Ash again. Its eyes moved between them slowly, carefully, The way you look at something when you are trying to understand the relationship between two things you are seeing together for the first time. It was the oldest dragon. Arlo could tell by the way the others in the fleet were positioned around it, not behind it exactly but oriented toward it, the way things arranged themselves around a center. Its scales were darker than the others. There were long, pale marks across its neck and one shoulder that could only be old scars from something Arlo could not imagine. It lowered its great head, slow, deliberate, all the way down, until its chin was level with the observation wall, its enormous eyes looking directly at Arlo from less than 40 meters away. Arlo breathed out. Ash moved forward to the transparent wall and pressed its face against it. Its whole face, forehead and nose and the side of one cheek, the way a young creature presses against a barrier toward something it wants to reach. A sound came out of it that Arlo had never heard before. Not the deep answer call from earlier. Something smaller. Something that needed no translation at all. Arlo stood up slowly and walked to the wall. He placed his hand flat against the surface, at the exact spot where Ash's forehead was pressed from the other side. The wall was cold. He kept his hand there. They stayed like that, the boy and the young dragon, a wall of transparent material between them, one hand and one forehead pressed to opposite sides of the same surface, for a long moment that Arlo did not count and would not have been able to. Then Ash stepped back. It looked at Arlo with its golden eyes, steady and calm and full of something that Arlo could not name but did not need to. Then it turned toward the wall and looked outward, at the elder dragon, at the fleet, at the dark and the stars and the open space that was home. Arlo stepped back too. Open the external bay door on level 2, he said to the room, to the speaker on the wall, to Vesk wherever he was watching. Let Ash go home. There was a pause. Then the sound of a heavy mechanism turning. The elder dragon outside watched. The fleet did not move. Ash walked to the bay door as it opened, stopped once at the threshold and looked back at Arlo. Arlo nodded. Ash stepped out into the dark and was gone. The fleet moved then, not fast, not dramatically, just turning with the slow certainty of things that knew where they were going. One by one the enormous shapes shifted and began to drift away from the station, out toward the edge of sensor range, back into the dark between the stars. The elder dragon was the last to turn. It paused for just a moment, facing the observation deck, facing the boy standing alone behind the curved transparent wall with one hand still raised. Then it turned and followed its family home. The station was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not the quiet of night cycle, when the lights dimmed and the corridors emptied and the only sounds were the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional footstep of a late-walking cadet. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a place after something large has happened and nobody has yet figured out what to do with it. The fleet had been gone for 6 hours. The alarms were off. The weapons array had been stood down. The external cameras still ran their continuous feed, showing nothing but empty space and stars and the distant smear of the nebula, the same as always. If you looked at those screens now, you would not know anything had happened at all. But everyone knew. Vesk spent most of that first day in his office writing. Not reports in the usual sense. Those would come later, formal and structured and routed through the proper channels. What he wrote first was a single page, plain and direct, addressed to the Interstellar Council. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied with it. The final version was not long. It said that at 0400 station time, a fleet of no fewer than 40 Dragon-class Drakari had surrounded Station Vareth 9 in apparent search of a juvenile of their species held in the Academy's beast pens. It said that all standard contact attempts had failed. It said that the situation had been resolved without casualties or weapons discharge. And then it said the part that Vesk had rewritten most carefully because he wanted it to be exact. It said, resolution was achieved through direct nonverbal communication between the fleet and Cadet Arlo Finch, human, age 17. No translator was used. No protocol was followed. Contact was made through what can only be described as empathic presence, a form of communication no recorded civilization has demonstrated with Dragon-class Drakari, or with Dragon-class Drakari at all, as their existence was previously considered unconfirmed. He read it one more time. Then he sent it. The report moved fast. By the end of the 2nd day it had reached the nearest council relay station. By the end of the 4th day it had been distributed to every member civilization with a seat on the Interstellar Council, which was 43 of them. By the end of the 1st week, Vesk had received responses from 31 of those civilizations, most of them containing some version of the same question, worded differently but meaning the same thing. Are you certain? Vesk replied to each one with the same answer. He attached the observation deck camera footage. He attached the external sensor logs showing the fleet's arrival, its stillness during the 6 hours of failed contact attempts, and its departure following Arlo's interaction. He attached the weapons array targeting records showing that not a single shot had been fired. He did not add anything extra. He did not need to. The footage spoke with a clarity that no additional words could improve. Arlo did not know most of this was happening. He knew the report had been written because Vesk had told him, briefly and without ceremony, in a short meeting the morning after. Vesk had said that Arlo's actions would be documented and that the documentation would be shared with the council. He had said it the same way he said most things, flatly with no particular weight on any one word. Then he had told Arlo he was excused from drills for 2 days and dismissed him. Arlo had nodded and left. He spent the first of those 2 days doing almost nothing. He sat in the small common room for a while. He ate, though he couldn't remember afterward what he had eaten. He slept for a long time in the afternoon, a deep and dreamless sleep that he hadn't been looking for but clearly needed. On the second day he went to the pens. Goff was at his desk. He looked up when Arlo came in and then looked back at his screen without saying anything, which was, from Goff, the equivalent of a warm welcome. Arlo walked down the corridor between the pens. The other Drakri were there, the 3 standard class animals from the Grand Trial, and 2 others used for senior scouting exercises. They watched him pass the way they always did, with their quiet golden attention. He stopped at each one for a moment. He was not performing anything. He just wanted to be there. At the end of the corridor was Ash's pen. The gate was open. The pen was empty. The water trough had been cleaned and refilled out of habit, apparently, and then left. The floor was bare. There was a small mark on the wall near the back corner where Ash had rubbed against the surface so many times that the paint had worn away in a long, smooth arc. Arlo went inside and sat down on the floor. He sat in the middle of the pen, cross-legged, the same way he had sat outside it for months before he ever went in. He didn't look at anything in particular. He just sat there in the empty space where Ash had been, in the silence that had a different shape than other silences because of what used to fill it. He didn't know how long he had been there when he heard footsteps. Petra sat down beside him without asking if it was all right. She looked at the empty pen the same way he was looking at it, not studying it, not searching it for something, just looking. She had a small container of something warm that she had brought from the mess room and she put it on the floor between them without saying anything. They sat like that for a long time. The station moved around them, the hum of the ventilation, the distant sound of drills starting up again somewhere above, the ordinary business of a place returning to itself after something extraordinary. None of it reached all the way down here. Eventually Petra said, "Do you think Ash knew? What was happening? That the family was outside?" Arlo thought about it. "Yes," he said. "From the first vibration. Ash knew before any of us did." "And it waited," Petra said. "Not a question. It waited," Arlo said. Petra was quiet for a moment. "That took a lot of trust," she said. "Waiting when the thing you wanted was right there on the other side of the wall." Arlo looked at the worn arc on the wall where Ash had rubbed. "Ash had practice," he said. "We waited together for a long time before any of this." Petra picked up the container from the floor and held it in both hands. "Are you all right?" she asked. It was a direct question, which was the only kind she asked. Arlo considered it honestly. "I think so," he said. "I just miss it." Petra nodded. "That makes sense," she said simply. And that was enough, because she didn't try to fix it or move past it or suggest it would get easier soon. She just agreed that it made sense, which was the truest and most useful thing anyone could have said. They sat together until the light in the corridor shifted toward evening cycle, and then they walked back up to the residential level side by side, not talking much, which was one of the best things about Petra. She understood that silence between 2 people who trusted each other was not empty. 3 weeks passed. The academy returned to its routines. Drills, meals, training, competition. Bram Solis had not called Arlo pet boy since the morning of the Grand Trial, which was now almost a month ago. He did not speak to Arlo directly either. He simply existed in the same spaces and looked at Arlo occasionally with that same unresolved expression, the one that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite anything else, still sitting somewhere in between, still working itself out. Dale had asked Arlo one question about a week after the fleet left. He had stopped him in the corridor and asked, without any of the usual edge in his voice, how Arlo had known the fleet wasn't going to attack. Arlo had thought about it and said he hadn't known for certain. He had just understood what they wanted. Dale had looked at him for a moment and then walked on. He seemed, if not satisfied, then at least finished with the question. Finn had started sitting with Arlo and Petra at meals. The message came on a Tuesday, station time. Vesk called Arlo to his office in the late afternoon. The office was the same as always, plain, orderly, a single window showing the stars. Vesk was standing when Arlo arrived, which was unusual. He had a screen in his hand. He told Arlo that 3 days ago, a long-range sensor array at the edge of human-settled space had detected a large biological signature. Single entity. Dragon class. It had arrived slowly and positioned itself just outside the boundary of settled space and stopped there. It had been there for 3 days. It was not moving. It was not signaling. It was not threatening anything. It was waiting. The Interstellar Council had been notified. 43 civilizations had received the report. Discussions had been held and responses had been drafted and committees had been formed. And after all of that, the council had reached a conclusion that Vesk read from the screen in his flat, careful voice without any additional commentary. The conclusion was that there was one being in known space who had successfully made contact with a Dragon-class Dracary. One being who had stood in front of a fleet of 40 of them and been answered. One being that a Dragon-class Dracary had trusted. The council was requesting that being be sent. Vesk lowered the screen and looked at Arlo. Arlo stood in the plane office with the window behind Vesk showing the stars, and thought about a juvenile dragon pressing its face to a wall of glass. He thought about his mother's handwriting on thin paper. He thought about the elder dragon lowering its great scarred head in the dark. He thought about what it meant that something had crossed the distance between stars to wait at the edge of a place it didn't know, in the only way it could, for someone to come out and meet it. "When do I leave?" he asked. Vesk looked at him for a moment. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not quite pride, not quite anything Arlo had a name for. Then it was gone and he was simply Vesk again. "Tomorrow," he said. "First light." Arlo nodded. He turned to go. "Cadet," Vesk said. Arlo stopped. "You did well," Vesk said. Just that. 3 words, plain and even, with no decoration on them. Arlo looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked out into the corridor, back toward the station that was already behind him in the way that mattered, back toward Petra and Finn and the ordinary sounds of an extraordinary place, and then, tomorrow, first light, forward toward the dark and the stars and a dragon waiting at the edge of human space for the one person in the galaxy who had remembered how to listen.